Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Trail Talk. I'm Edie, and I am here live at the Chisholm Trail Heritage Center in Duncan, Oklahoma. I'm in our classroom studio today, and I'm really excited for you to be able to join me today. This is a super interesting, historical, eye-opening lesson. I mean, I hope you like it as much as I did studying it. And what we didn't put in the promo is that this is just part one. There is so much information about the history of the cattle ranch industry. We did kind of a cattle industry lesson before, but that was present day. And this is a very historical look at how it all actually came about. And so I'm just going to kind of get us rolling on that. So the first thing I want to point out to you is it really kind of all began with the 5 civilized tribes being brought to Indian Territory. So the Louisiana Purchase resulted in an influx of, more European kind of settlers coming into a large portion of what became the United States. And the influx is the same place where these 5 tribes lived. And they readily adapted to the ways of life that these new settlers brought in with them. And that included plantation farming, slave ownership, some ranching, just all of that kind of thing. So that is why they were referred to as the 5 civilized tribes, because they just very they just kind of adapted to basically the new European or white settlers' way of life, and blended in, became very wealthy landowners, cotton farmers, and all of that sort of thing. So when they were forcibly moved to Indian Territory, they brought that way of life with them. So they had, they raised plants like in gardens and ate those plants, added that to their diet besides the meat and the fish that they would hunt and have. And so they come here, and this is, where kind of the beginning of Oklahoma really starts out, is when we become Indian Territory. And so I wanted to show you this map just to kind of give you an idea. I mean, nobody really talks about the Quapaw and the Seneca, but in 1830, this is what Indian Territory looked like. And the Quapaw and the Seneca were actually a part of that forcible move. They just weren't considered part of the 5 civilized tribes, and the numbers in their tribes are very small. You can see they just have that little corner up there. This Cherokee outlet had been given to the Cherokee tribe as an outlet for the bison to go to and live, and they could go and they could hunt the bison there in a little more traditional, I guess you could say, way. And so that this is kind of how things looked at that point. And make note, this Cherokee outlet up here, because that kind of becomes a very important part in the story of the cattle ranch industry. The Cherokee outlet was about 150 miles east and west and 60 miles north and south. So it was like 600,000 acres, something crazy like that. Oh, a 6 million, my bad, a 6 million acre strip of land. And if you're familiar with the land run history, you know that was the where the last land run actually happened. But it it was a place where, so like Kansas Territory established 1854, the ranchers up here would bring their cattle down and allow them to graze in this Cherokee outlet. This was a common thing that people did in those days. And there was a historian named Edward Everett Dale, and his essay, I'm going to call it an essay. It's about a 10-page historical fact sheet, or written out kind of, it's an essay about the ranching here in Oklahoma. And so he kind of starts talking about, like I had mentioned, about how with the purchase of the Louisiana purchase land and from France, and how the East Coast agricultural lifestyle had moved west. This area in here, Indian Territory, it was kind of like, you know, there was civilization on that side, and the misunderstood but considered savage way of life of the Native Americans on this side. And so that makes what happens in Oklahoma kind of a very unique story, and just kind of adds to our history, I think. Just when we just stop and break it down in little increments like this, I think it's just so amazing how unique the history of Oklahoma is. And I mean, people talk about that a lot, and you know, oh yeah, Oklahoma's so unique and this and that, but it's really not. I don't think that word is overused, and I do think that it's accurate. And I don't mean unique meaning super special or you know, really great. I mean, obviously what happens with the Native Americans and all that, that's not a great uplifting yeehaw kind of story. But it's unique in how it all came about. No other state in the nation had the same series of events that took place. So one of the things that happened was I'm going to skip forward a few. There was a great decline in the bison herds. This is one of my favorite bison pictures ever, by the way. So we know now this was, you know, happened much later on in the later 1800s. But the bison herds that had lived in the Cherokee outlet were, you know, practically gone. And we know that there were several factors. One was the dividing the herd, the giant buffalo bison herd, into a northern herd and a southern herd, which made the ability to have a healthy herd. It made that a less likely situation. The fact that the Native Americans were also, you know, pushed into Indian Territory, not able to go hunt them anymore. The ones that lived in the Cherokee outlet and all the others were hunted to almost extinction. But always remember too that there was the tick fever situation that I don't know that is always counted into that. And it really was a part of what wiped out these herds. I think possibly the tick fever started with the cattle herds though. And the cattle herds bringing the tick fever into the buffalo herds as they mixed while they were on cattle drives and stuff like that. So anyway, all this series of unfortunate events, but the lower numbers of the buffalo is also a reason that the cattle industry came into Oklahoma. So the cattle drives began in 1867. Now they have 1865 here, and that's because the Chisholm Trail started in 1867. Some of these others were being used, and you'll notice the Chisholm Trail goes here to Abilene or Ellsworth, Kansas. Dodge City is kind of about right over here. It was another stopping place, but we always teach about how the cattle drives went from South Texas up to Kansas, crossing Oklahoma. And so this essay refers to this being the breeding grounds, and then north up here were the feeding grounds. And I didn't quite understand what he was referring to until I continued reading. So oftentimes the cattle would be purchased once they got to Abilene, and they would be put on a train and shipped to the Northeast, Chicago, New York City, places like that, where then they would be slaughtered and the meat would be sold to people, which was the whole reason the cattle drive started. The beef was in high demand, which equaled high prices. And so all these cattle in Texas, they had a place to sell them and make money. But they didn't all board a train and go off to the slaughterhouse. Some of them were purchased and they were taken up here further north, and they were allowed to graze and fatten up for 3 or 4 months. Then they were sold. So sometimes they were sold by the head, but oftentimes they were sold by weight. And so even if, say, the people that purchased the cattle here, they bought them by the head, if they could turn around and sell them by weight after they let them fatten up for 3 or 4 months, then, more money was going to be coming their way. And that was going to, just continue to push that industry. Now, as they came through, you can see the Chisholm Trail and the Western Trail both go right through the Cherokee Outlet. And so that was still a great area to graze because the bison were essentially gone by then. So they were allowed to graze there. Plus, as they came through Indian Territory, the tribes were often in need of meat. And so they could let them graze on their land. Sometimes these cattle drives actually went a little longer than what I have taught previously, because they could let them fatten up. They could graze them for a month or so, and the tribes would allow that. And then they would take some of the cattle as payment. Sometimes they would even, make a written agreement, and then they would take them up there and sell them for even more. So, you get like 3/4 of the trip over the 1,000 miles, you go 700, 800 of that distance, and you just park here and let those cattle get nice and fat and then finish out that journey. I mean, it seemed like kind of a smart thing to me. So, that would kind of be the situation. So, after the Civil War, here's what happened to Indian Territory. All 5 of the 5 civilized tribes fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Not everyone in the tribes fought for the Confederacy. Some also fought for the Union, but as a whole, the majority fought for the South, and it was because of the threat they felt on their way of life. They felt like the South, because remember, they're sovereign nations still. They felt like the South more represented who they were, their lifestyle, the way they made money, and it was these large plantations. You know, they were very a lot of them were quite wealthy and very they owned a lot of land. And plus, during this time, everything was considered, the land belonged to the nation as a whole. And I'm referring to the Cherokee Nation, Creek, Choctaw. And so it was communal. It was not divided up into pieces given to each family. That came later. That was called allotment. And that was kind of the beginning of the end for this tribal land. But so following the Civil War, the South lost, and the United States government said, you guys, we did, you know, gave you all of this. You fought for the South. So we're going to take a bunch of your land. So they took all of that, all of that was ceded to back to the US government. Now, eventually that portion becomes Oklahoma territory. And, you know, once the land runs happen, but this is what the state looked like, or Indian Territory looked like following the Civil War. And so this is what it was like during the days of the cattle drives. And even though the Cherokee Outlet is not outlined up there, it does find its way back to being a part of Indian Territory and belonging to the Cherokee Nation. Okay. So here we have Indian Territory. Now this is about 1876, and this is after the Plains tribes are forced into Indian Territory. And so now we see the land is all filled up. All of that area that came down here, this is all now shared amongst all of these other tribes. And the Cherokees essentially have two large areas of land. And we know, you know, the first land run, the second land run, this the third one, I believe, the fourth, wow, I'm blank on where the fourth one, the last one up here, the Cherokee Outlet. And then here are the two areas that they did buy. Well, there ends up being a place down here that they call Big Pasture. That was literally the last pasture land that people were able to use to for their cattle to graze on. And that was the very last part. It became part of the state of, well, the territory in 1906. But here you can see this was 1876, and we have the Cherokee Outlet here. So ranching had by the late 1800s become a bit of a fad. Eastern college graduates would move out west and try to start a ranch. Teddy Roosevelt kind of got in on all of that. People from foreign countries, Baron Richthofen, the Marquis of Moray, came, and everyone wanted to be a cattle rancher. And these large corporations were formed, and those ranchers then took state and federal offices, like they were elected to hold offices. And so you see where the financial power of this industry influences the political climate of the country. So now things that are being decided are very heavily influenced with the ranch owner in mind. Interesting how that all works out, isn't it? So the the herds gone during the Civil War. The main source of the cattle herds right down here in this reddish area in South Texas. This is where the wild longhorns lived. After the Civil War, the ranchers come home. Their domestic herds were out of control. And so all these cattle need to find a way to the northeast. And so there we have the cattle drives. And again, we have these breeding grounds here, the feeding grounds up here. And Oklahoma is just sitting there in the middle, just being used as a passage to get to those railroads. So white settlement was prohibited, and oh, here we go. White settlement was prohibited in all of this part, including the Cherokee Outlet. Okay, that no white people were supposed to be living in this Indian territory. Now this is, after the Civil War, before 1889. All right. And those are the years after the Civil War, before the land run, when the cattle drives were happening. So these ranchers just felt like these grazing lands are so great. Why can't we just kind of hang out here and let our cattle fatten up and take advantage of all these grazing lands? At this point, the 5 civilized tribes, the Plains tribes, they did not own cattle. They were not a part of this ranching system. And so the ranchers saw this as wasted grasslands. And I mean, they're businessmen. They have a lot of investment in all of this. And I think I can understand their point of view. It's just that it wasn't theirs to take, it just wasn't. But they would come in with their cattle. And so one thing is, Texas had a good climate for crops and cattle and such. Kansas, further north, it was, colder, harder winters. Oklahoma had advantages and disadvantages. Okay. The climate was mild enough to let the cattle live in the winter in open range without much consideration for loss. It was cool enough, though, that the animals could fatten up. They weren't under the stress of the heat. Like we've been under a lot of stress from the heat lately. But that wasn't necessarily the case in those days. The Indians who lived there were very hungry. And so there was a sense of anxiety that their cattle might be killed or stolen to feed these people who were, by this time, they were totally dependent on the United States government for food. And the government didn't, I don't know if they just didn't plan well enough, if the transportation was just so slow that the food was often spoiled or had insects or whatever in it, by the time it got to the destination. But there really was this shortage of food, and there were people who were very hungry in Indian Territory. So that was one of the disadvantages. So the Department of the Interior, go to this next slide. So what we have here, we have three government entities who now come into play in the situation that's beginning to, the pieces are kind of coming together for this thing to happen in Indian Territory. First of all, you have the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're the people who, there are agents for each of the tribes. Some of the tribes, their land was so vast that they had multiple agents, or one agent would have a huge area. And so there was a situation where these agents were under a lot of stress, trying to get the right amount of food to feed the population they were responsible for, as well as making sure that the Native Americans were adhering to the agreement, the treaties that they had signed. All right, then you have the Department of the Interior, who's kind of overseeing all of that, as well as you know, the crossing of the lands and all of that sort of thing. That was kind of this, the Indian Affairs was under the Department of the Interior. But then you also have the War Department. And I know it seems weird to have the War Department, you know, called that, but this was right after the Civil War. The War Department was established, I believe, right after, if I read these Roman numerals right, I believe that 1778 was when the War Department was established. So, I mean, in those years, the United States was at war. We had the French and Indian War. We had, and then along came the Civil War. And so the War Department was kind of, you know, we had the cavalry, and it was 1789. So you had you had the cavalry, and you had you know, all these people who were they would fought in the Civil War, and they stayed in with the military, and they went out west to try to help quell all of the fighting, the wars that was happening with the Native Americans. And so you have these three entities, and I think this is where things get really, really interesting. So the tribes wanted to sign treaties with the ranchers to allow them to graze cattle, and then they could receive money in return. They really were sovereign nations, and so making a decision like that should have been something that they could do. But the agent from the Bureau of Indian Affairs had to know that this was going on and had to kind of oversee some things. And anytime that, you know, there ended up being some kind of a conflict between the ranchers and the Native Americans, well, the Department of the Interior would ask the War Department to go in and you know, change what was happening. And the War Department wasn't really interested in doing that. And so they just would not respond. Now, all of this is according to this historian. Again, I want to make that clear that I'm using a lot of his information, even though I have verified that some of this, that this is, these are true events. Edward Everett Dale. Anyway, so they the War Department kind of urged the Department of the Interior to allow the grazing to happen. I mean, if you have grazing lands and you don't have an animal to come in and mow it down, basically, it gets overgrown. It's not as healthy. I mean, this is all, you know, part of the cycle of you know, the nature, and grasses are supposed to be eaten down by animals. Anyway, the War Department thought maybe that was a good idea. The Department of the Interior, not so sure. So finally, it comes down to an agent from the Cheyenne Arapaho tribes named John Miles. And he called the Indians together in a council, got a majority of them, and that got them to lease nearly all of their reservation to 7 cattlemen, a group of 7 cattlemen, for 10 years at a yearly rental of 2 cents an acre. So that amounted to just over 3 million acres of land for which the Indians were to receive $62,000 a year. Now, I think that sounds like not enough compensation, but I'm not that good at trying to determine the 2 cents an acre versus whatever an acre today, you know, with inflation and all that sort of thing. Plus, this was all undeveloped land. So the leases were sent to Washington for approval by the Department of the Interior, because remember, Mr. Miles worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is under the Department of the Interior. And he wrote a letter describing the benefits that were certain to, I mean, he saw this as a real plus for the people he worked for. So the one thing I want to point out here is the agents that worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they didn't really have a very good reputation. And I think that there were some, like Mr. Miles, who seemed genuinely interested in helping. Anyway, so all of a sudden now, Washington, D.C. is 100% aware of what's happening in Indian Territory. And think of the loss of control that could happen if these Indians were allowed to just make thousands of dollars on their own. They become not so reliant on the U.S. government anymore, which, I mean, Mr. Miles, I think, saw it as a way for them to be able to maybe take care of themselves. But that was one of the things that the U.S. government didn't want to have happen. They wanted to have more control over them because they wanted them living in Indian Territory. Okay, so the Secretary of the Interior, named Edward Fenlon, wrote something, I think it must be a well-known letter. This was my first introduction to it, called the Fenlon Letter. And so he goes and writes this in 1800s language, which is a little flowery. It's probably a little bit legalese. And so I am not going to read it to you. But what he basically says is, so if you have an agreement with someone, we are not going to say, okay, we approve of that agreement. But if someone comes along and tries to butt in on that agreement, like if there was an 8th cattleman who decided he was going to run some cattle on the Cheyenne Arapaho land, and he wasn't a part of this paid agreement, well, they would not be allowed to interfere with that. Okay, so they're basically saying, hey, we kind of have our hands off of this situation. If there was any kind of disagreement on either side of the people who had the treaty or the lease agreement, it says, for any reason, the department will consider it desirable for the public interest to exercise its right of supervision to the extent of removing all occupants from the territory without reference to the lease or agreement. So they're saying, and if you guys can't play nice, then we're just going to say nobody's playing. Everybody has to get off of the land. And they said, all parties accepting such agreements should accept the same to all conditions herein, subject to any future action of Congress. And so they're saying any agreement that you think you might make, at any time, Congress could decide to do something different with this territory, and it would dissolve your treaty. So this Fenlon letter was quite the little power play, I think. It was, the man said, the writer, Mr. Dale, says this was short of absurd. It invited ranchmen to enter the Indian Territory, I like when it's called that, and you know, go in and try to make some kind of an agreement with the Native Americans, put a premium on bribery and corruption made every agency employee a person to be flattered, cajoled, and if possible bribed, with large interests at stake. I mean, the agents, perhaps that's where they got their bad reputation. I mean, they could be offered all kinds of money by the cattlemen to let's write up a lease agreement, and here we'll give you this much off the top. I mean, Oklahoma's had a lot of corruption in government, and this was before it was state government, but I mean, you can kind of see where some of this is going. And then, but then there was no way to enforce any of it. Nobody could enforce anything. If men had no agreements approved by the agent, but they were friendly with a certain smaller band of Native Americans, then maybe they could make just a little aside agreement. And the people who had paid the big money and made a big agreement, wait, that's our land. I mean, this letter was basically a mess, created a mess. And anyway, it demanded men without leases be excluded, but the War Department, when called upon for troops, refused to furnish them on the ground that the leases had not been approved by the Department of the Interior. So, you know, things did go south, and nobody came to help. Conditions at the Cheyenne Arapaho Reservation grew steadily worse. And finally, Agent Miles resigned, and the new agent couldn't handle the situation either. He was at a loss. He just did not know what to do. The Native Americans were beyond control, partly as a result of interference from the rival groups of cattlemen. I mean, the cattlemen are in there, you know, probably stirring a lot of stuff up, but they wanted the grazing land, and a general outbreak was threatened. And that resulted in the government sending General Sheridan, the great General Sheridan, who led battles in the Civil War and in many battles with Native Americans. He's a well-known general. He was sent to that reservation with all available troops in the West to quiet the trouble, and the president at last ordered all cattle to be removed from the reservation within 40 days. So this was in 1885. And the number of cattle was estimated about 210,000 head, probably it could have been much larger. By December, they were all removed, but the range surrounding Indian Territory did not have a lot of grass. And the winter of 85 and 86 was so harsh that these cattle died of starvation and exposure to the elements. It was a really, really bad situation. And they believed that the losses of that winter were no doubt in part due to what happened between these three government entities and the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. So I'm going to end the lesson right there. I felt like that was kind of a good place to stop for today, but come back next week, because I'm going to pick up right there, and we're going to get back into the Cherokee Outlet and some equally crazy kind of things that start happening up there. And be sure and tune in tomorrow. My friend Chris Deal, the president of the Duncan Chamber of Commerce, is going to be on Trail Talk, and he's going to talk about Leadership Duncan, which is this great leadership organization. They you go through it in a class. They meet monthly. I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm going to talk about it tomorrow. Anyway, please join us at 3 o'clock tomorrow and learn about Leadership Duncan. They're the new class. The mixer was held last night and it starts Friday. So anyway, I will see you guys then. And until tomorrow, happy trails.